Hello everyone. In the last video we set up the course files, which is the web programming folder here, and we also installed VS Code, and I encouraged you to pin it to your taskbar down here at the bottom, so you can go ahead and click that to start VS Code. Mine came up in my other window here. Here it is. I'm going to drag it over to this monitor. And now it should remember that you were working in the web programming folder the last time. If not, you can open up the web programming folder by going to File and then Open Folder, and then you should be able to navigate to your web programming folder and then hit the select button when you see that. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to be working on HTML first in this course. We're going to be covering 3 languages, starting with HTML here. So what I want you to do is you can click this little arrow here to open up the HTML folder, and I've got some worksheets in here that you can do throughout the course if you want. But what we want to do right now is we want to add a new web page to this folder. So here, if you right click where it says HTML, if you right click on the HTML folder and then choose new file, now we can add a new file, and we want to type in a name for it first. So let's just call this one overview.html. So remember, web pages have an HTML file extension, so that's why we named it .html there. Okay, so we get an empty file. And we can get started here. Now, in the last lesson, I showed you that you could just type in HTML and hit enter, and that would put in your HTML tags, which enclose the rest of the whole web page that we're about to create here. But I want to do something different right now. What we're going to do, let's erase this if you did this with me. And first of all, I'm going to make this bigger so it's easier to see, and just rearrange a few things. Maybe that's too big. Let's go with that. How's that? Okay. And I hid the Explorer. You can hide the Explorer window altogether if you drag that all the way across. You can hide the Explorer window so you get more space to work on your code here. Okay, so what I want you to do this time around is type in HTML. And now we have 3 choices here in this little pop-up window. The one that we're going to choose is this middle one that has the :5 at the end. Go ahead and choose that and then hit enter. Now, this looks a little bit different than what we worked with yesterday, and I don't want you to get thrown off by some of the stuff that we haven't talked about yet. So I'm just what we want to do is let's just focus on the body element. We remember the body element is where you put all the visible content on the web page. So that's our primary focus for today, and we'll get to this other stuff that you see here later. I suppose one thing that we should do is update the title here. So let's go change that default, which says document, and let's just make the title be overview of HTML. And as you know, the title element will show up in the browser tab. The other thing that I want to do here is it's real important for beginning students to indent their code properly. And one thing I don't like about this is that VS Code doesn't exactly indent this technically correct. So what we should do is when we have an element that's nested inside of another element, we should indent it. So here we have the head element and the body element, and they are not indented. So I'm just going to click and drag through both of those elements and hit tab. Okay, not a big deal, but it's important for beginners to indent their code properly. By the way, this code that we're using as our starter code now is a more modern version of HTML than what we did before when we just had the opening and closing HTML tags. One of the things that you'll notice that we didn't see before is this first line. That is called the doc type declaration. You don't really need to worry about this right now, but what it does is it declares that we're using the latest version of HTML, which is version 5. So remember when we did the shortcut, we saw it said HTML:5. Ironically, there is no mention of 5 in that line. I never understood why that is, but this declares that we're using the latest version of HTML, which is version 5. Okay, let's jump down to the body. That's where we're going to do most of our work. And before we actually start adding more code to this, I just want to talk about what HTML means. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So let's break that apart. Hypertext, that means that it has it's text that has hyperlinks in it. So we'll learn how to do that shortly in the class, how to add hyperlinks to a page. But that's, the backbone of the internet is a bunch of web pages that are all linked together that you can surf through by clicking through links. So that's what hypertext means. But what we're going to be concerned with mostly today is the markup part of it. And markup basically means it's a way to annotate the content of your web page. Now that might sound kind of strange, but you can think of a web page as like a newspaper where the main story, the title is going to be big and bold, and you might have another story that's not quite as important, that might not be the title might not be quite as big. You might want to mark up some content so that it's in italics, just to make the newspaper easier to read. So HTML is a way to make a web page kind of appear like a newspaper. In other words, it's a way to structure the content of a page. Let's see what that means here. What I want you to do is go ahead and put your cursor right where mine is. It's in between the opening and closing body tags, and type in H1 and hit enter like that. That'll give you an H1 element. So there's my opening H1 tag and my closing H1 tag. And then let's put some content inside of that H1 element here. So let's just make it say this is an H1 element. Okay, and then you can save it by pressing Control S, or that's the easiest way to save it. And now let's check this out in the browser here. So we installed the Open in Browser extension, which means that we should be able to right click anywhere here in the background and scroll down to Open in Default Browser. And here it is. Here's our H1 element. So you can see that the content inside of that element is big and bold. Okay, now let's Alt-Tab back to VS Code. I showed you that shortcut in the last video. If you do Alt-Tab, you can quickly get back to VS Code. And then put your cursor right here at the end of the H1 element and hit Enter. And let's add another element here. This time it's going to be an H2. So type in H2 and hit Enter. And then the content that we're going to put inside of this H2 element can be, this is an H2 element, like that. And then let's go ahead and save it with Control S. So I'm pressing Control S, and then we're going to Alt-Tab back over to the browser. And now here, I want to refresh the browser. Every time you make a change and save it, you want to refresh the browser. I can either click on this button right here, or the other way that I can refresh is by pressing the F5 key. That's a quick way too. Anyways, the page reloads and it shows the changes that we just made, and you can see here's the content that we put inside the H2 element. It's a little bit smaller than what we put inside the H1 element. By the way, the H stands for heading. So a heading 1 is going to make the content inside of it big and bold. A heading 2 would be a little bit less big, but still bold. Okay, I'm going to Alt-Tab back over to VS Code, and just for fun, let's go ahead and put our cursor right underneath the H2 element, and let's add an H3 element. So type in H3 and hit Enter, and it puts the syntax and the tags in for us, and we can just make the content say this is an H3 element. Okay, and then I'll save it, and then Alt-Tab back to the browser and refresh it. I'm going to press F5 to refresh it, and there you go. You can see that we have the content inside of the H3 element is not quite as big as what we see in the H2 element. So these, you can go all the way to H7, I believe, but I really only use H1s, 2s, and 3s because once you get down to H4s, it starts to look about like regular font size anyways. So there's how you can structure content so that it appears in various heading sizes. Use the H1, H2, or H3 elements to do so. I'm going to switch back over to VS Code here. If you want to add a paragraph of content, you would use a P element. So I'm going to put my cursor right after the H3 element and hit Enter. And then I'm going to type in P and hit enter, and it'll put the P tags in place for me. And then the content that I'll put inside of this P element will be, this is a paragraph. Just like that. I'm going to go ahead and save it with Control S, and then Alt Tab back over to the browser and refresh it with F5. And you can see there's a paragraph. It's hard to tell it's a paragraph. It's because it's just a simple, a single line. But anyways, that's how you can structure content for your web pages into paragraphs. Just use P elements. Okay, let's go back over to VS Code here, and let's add another paragraph. So put your cursor right underneath the first paragraph that we added, and then add a P element, the opening and closing P tags, and then split those apart by hitting the Enter key. Now, the reason why I did that here is because we're going to add a few lines, a few sentences to this P element here. So let's just type in this. This is a sentence. How's that? This is a sentence. Okay. And now let's add another sentence right here. So I'm going to hit Enter and then type in, this is another sentence. Okay. Now, that's the reason why I put the opening P tag all by itself and the closing P tag all by itself on its own line, is that I was adding multiple lines inside of the P element. So if you've got an element that doesn't have a whole lot of content in it, you can put everything on one line like this. But if you start adding multiple lines inside of an element, or if a single line stretches out to be super long, then what you want to do is split everything apart so that the opening tag is all by itself on a line and the closing tag is on its own line, and these two should be indented exactly the same. So you can see that that's what these little lines are for in VS Code, is to make sure that you indent things properly. And everything that you put inside of this element here should also be indented like that. And once our pages get to be big and complicated, it makes it much easier to read the code if you indent everything properly. Okay, as you can see here, I put my sentences on different lines here, and that makes it easier for me to read my code in VS Code. But look at what happens in the browser when we run this page now. So go ahead and save your changes, Control S, Alt Tab back to the browser, and then refresh with F5. And you can see that those line breaks are ignored. So this is something that will take a little bit of getting used to, but HTML ignores extra white space. And what that means is it'll give you one space. So luckily your words, the spaces in between your words will show up, but it won't show any more spaces beyond that. Let me prove that to you here. I'm just going to go over here and maybe put a tab there and maybe a couple of line breaks there. And if I save this now and go back to the browser and reload it, you won't see any difference. So one thing to be aware of is that your code might have spaces in it or tabs or return carriages just to make it easier to read, but the browser will ignore that extra white space. Okay, I'm going to put this back to how it was. I'm pressing Control Z to undo those changes that I just made right here. And let's structure some of the content that's inside this paragraph. So for example, if I wanted this word to show up in bold text, I could put it inside of a B element like this. So here I'm going to put in an opening B tag. And then now you can see VS Code is trying to be clever and help me out here. It put in the syntax and the rest of the closing tag for me. I'm going to actually, but what I want to do is put the closing B tag behind another like that. Okay, so here I'm structuring content within the paragraph by making it bold. So you can use B elements to make text within a paragraph appear bold. Save that, Alt Tab back to the browser, and then refresh with F5, and now you can see here that that word is showing up in bold. Okay, now maybe I also want to make it underlined. So what I want to do here is put this B element inside of a U element. U stands for underline, and that will underline the content that's inside of it. So what I want to do here is put an opening U tag right here. Now, if I type in U and hit enter, it's going to put the opening and closing tags together like that. But what I want to do is move this closing U tag. I'm just going to cut that out, and I want to put it after the closing B tag like that. Okay, so now what I've got here is a B element that's nested inside of a U element, and so it should make the content be bold and underlined. Let's see how that looks. I'm going to save my changes. Alt tab back over to the browser here, hit refresh, F5, and now you can see that that word is underlined as well as bold. Let's go back to VS Code here, and what I want to point out now is that HTML documents are what we call hierarchical, and what that means is you've got things nested inside of other things. So what we've got here is a B element that's nested inside of a U element, that's nested inside of a P element, that's nested inside of a body element, that's nested inside of an HTML element. This is what we call a hierarchical structure. It's kind of like a file system on a computer. You have folders that have files and other folders nested within them. So the indentation, when we write our code, helps us see this hierarchical structure. And I will keep talking to you about indentation throughout the course, because I've learned that my students that don't indent properly have a hard time reading their code. Now with that in mind, I want to show you, I'm going to put a bug in this page right here, and hopefully you can see the problem. What if I take this closing B element and cut it and put it right there? That actually breaks the structure, our hierarchical structure, because it's not apparent whether the U element is inside the B element or the B element is inside the U element. So this is a bug that can happen. You need to be very careful with your tags to have them in the right places. Now, if I reload the page, I wouldn't actually see any problems here, but there could be a bug further on down the line that could be tricky to solve if I didn't maintain that hierarchical structure. So I'm going to do Control Z to undo all that and put it back to the way it should be. And I think that's going to do it for this video. And so the big takeaway here is that HTML is a way of marking up content on a web page. So you can structure content into paragraphs or headings, or as we'll see soon, you can structure content into lists and other things like that. And we'll get to that later in the course.